I woke up to the sound of a high-pitched engine tearing through the stillness of the morning, the unmistakable roar of an ATV ripping across my land. My coffee cup trembled in my grip as I stared out the window, watching the dust cloud rise in the golden sunlight. And there she was, Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, tearing across my property like she owned it. Her manicured hands gripped the handlebars of her oversized, mud-splattered four-wheeler as she cackled like she was starring in her own off-road reality show. For weeks I had endured this insanity. My once pristine property was now a scarred battlefield, tire tracks snaking across my yard like deep, ugly wounds. I had tried everything, talking, pleading, even getting the HOA involved. But Karen had a way of twisting reality itself. According to her, my land was part of some ridiculous HOA recreational zone. It didn't matter that my deed said otherwise, or that I had paid for every inch of this place with my hard-earned money. No, in Karen's mind, the world bent to her convenience. The first time I confronted her, I made the mistake of being polite. I stood in her path as she slowed her AV, the engine idling as she flipped up her ridiculous oversized sunglasses. "Oh, hey there, neighbor," she chirped as if we were best friends. "What's up?" I forced a smile. "Karen, this is private property. I need you to stop riding through here. It's damaging the land and honestly it's really disruptive." Her grin didn't waver. If anything, it widened. "Oh, sweetie, don't worry about it. The HOA bylaws allow community access to open spaces. It's all in the agreement. You should really read the fine print." She winked, revved the engine and took off, spitting gravel in my direction. There was no such rule. I checked. Twice. The HOA president, who, surprise, surprise, was also Karen, brushed me off with a wave of her hand when I brought it up in the next meeting. "We'll discuss it later," she had said with a fake smile, moving on to talk about hedge heights and mailbox color requirements. Then came the final insult. One morning I stepped outside and nearly choked on my coffee. Someone had planted a sign, a literal hand-painted sign, right on my property. It read, "Karen's Trail, AV's Welcome," in big bright letters complete with a spray-painted arrow pointing toward my land. I don't remember throwing my coffee cup. I just remember the rage flooding my veins as I stormed over, yanked the sign out of the ground and marched straight to her house. She answered the door with the same smug expression she always had. "Karen," I said, holding up the sign, "what the hell is this?" She had the audacity to laugh. "Oh, that. The community thought it would be cute to make it official. Everyone loves using your land for a little fun ride. I figured a sign would make it easier for the new folks to find their way. You don't own this land." I snapped. "I do. This is trespassing." Karen rolled her eyes. "Oh, lighten up. It's just a bit of harmless fun. You should be happy to share." That was it. That was the moment I realized there was no reasoning with Karen. No polite conversation, no appeal to logic would ever get through to her. She saw my land as hers, a playground she had claimed simply because no one had stopped her. That night I sat on my porch staring out at the mess she had made. My once green grass was shredded, my fence was barely holding together after being clipped by ATVs one too many times, and even my dog refused to go near the back of the property now. I had to do something. The HOA was useless. Talking was useless. Karen was never going to stop, not unless I gave her a reason to. And so the plan was born. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was worried, but because I was too busy crafting the perfect revenge. If Karen wanted to treat my land like an amusement park, fine. I would make sure she got an experience she would never forget. The next morning I started my work in silence. I made calls, did my research and reached out to a few professionals who knew exactly how to help me. If Karen thought she had the upper hand, she was about to learn a very painful lesson. This wasn't just about stopping her. This was about making sure that the next time she even thought about setting foot on my property, she'd break out in a cold sweat. She had spent months treating my land like it was hers, laughing in my face and rallying her little HOA cult to protect her. That was about to change. As I hammered the first post into the ground, a slow grin spread across my face. Karen had no idea what was coming. The next morning I woke up with a sense of purpose. Karen had pushed me to my limit and now it was my turn to push back. She had laughed in my face, dismissed my complaints and acted as though she had won. But she had no idea what was coming. I had spent the entire night crafting a plan so perfectly legal, so brilliantly designed, that she wouldn't even realize she was walking straight into a trap. It was time to reclaim what was mine. I started by doing my research. I wasn't about to get into a petty battle. I wanted to make sure that whatever I did was ironclad. I went through every single property law, checked my land rights, and even consulted my uncle who happened to be a lawyer. The more I learned, the more I realized just how reckless Karen had been. She had been trespassing on my land for months without a second thought. If I played this right, she wouldn't just be humiliated, she would have no choice but to stop for good. The first step was setting up surveillance. I installed high-quality cameras all around my property, hidden but perfectly positioned to capture every angle of the so-called Karen's trail. These cameras weren't just for evidence, they were my insurance. No matter what happened next, I wanted proof that Karen had brought it on herself. I even made sure to get night vision models, just in case she decided to be extra sneaky about her rides. Then I moved on to the real fun. I knew Karen wouldn't stop unless she felt the consequences firsthand. So I came up with something she'd never expect. First, I legally leased a section of my land to a local construction company. It was a simple short-term agreement, but the beauty of it was that now my property wasn't just personal land, it was an active work site. And guess what? Trespassing on an active work site came with way more serious consequences than just crossing onto private property. Once the lease was in place, I had the construction company drop off several piles of thick, wet mud right along her favorite riding path. It wasn't just any mud either, it was the kind that swallowed anything that got too deep into it. The kind that could turn a powerful ATV into a stranded, useless hunk of metal in seconds. But the best part? I didn't even have to do anything illegal to make it happen. It was simply part of the company's materials delivery. A completely normal process, just unfortunately located in the exact spot Karen loved to ride. To make sure she took the bait, I did something a little extra. I left part of my fence open, just enough to make it look like I hadn't finished putting it back up. If there was one thing I knew about Karen, it was that she couldn't resist an opportunity to prove she was in control. She would see that opening as an invitation. She wouldn't hesitate. Sure enough, the weekend came, and with it the unmistakable sound of Karen's ATV engine roaring to life. But this time she wasn't alone. She had brought friends. I watched from a distance as they gathered at the entrance to my land, revving their engines like they were about to embark on some grand adventure. Karen, leading the pack as always, pointed toward the open fence and grinned. I could practically hear her saying, "See? He can't even keep his own land secure. What a joke." And then they went for it. The first few seconds were normal, just the usual reckless riding, the sound of engines cutting through the air, dust flying everywhere. But then they hit the mud. At first it was just a bit of splatter on their tires, a minor inconvenience. But within seconds the front wheels started sinking. Karen, being the overconfident leader she was, tried to power through, gunning the throttle harder. Big mistake. The moment she pushed forward, her ATV lurched, the back tires spinning uselessly as the mud swallowed her front wheels. She let out a frustrated yell, waving for her friends to help. But they weren't doing much better. One by one, their ATVs sank deeper into the mud, engines roaring but going nowhere. Panic started to creep into Karen's voice as she realized what was happening. I stood just out of sight, watching it unfold through my cameras. She flailed, trying to get off the ATV without sinking herself, but the mud clung to her boots, nearly knocking her off balance. Her friends weren't any luckier. One guy was knee-deep in the mess, struggling to pull his machine free. Another girl had given up entirely and was wading back towards solid ground, shoes lost somewhere in the sludge. Then came the best part. Karen, red-faced and furious, pulled out her phone. I knew exactly what she was doing before she even said it. She was calling the cops. The sheer arrogance of it made me laugh. She actually thought she could spin this into me being at fault. Within minutes, the flashing red and blue lights appeared at the edge of my property. Karen, covered in mud, ran toward the officers like they were her personal saviors. "This is sabotage," she shrieked. "He did this on purpose. He's trying to ruin my property." One of the officers raised an eyebrow. "Your property?" Karen hesitated for just a second, then waved her hand dismissively. "I mean, it's technically his, but the HOA allows access. He's not allowed to do this." I stepped forward then, calm and collected, holding a folder of neatly printed documents. "Actually, officer," I said, "this land is 100% mine and I have the deed to prove it. Also, here's the signed lease agreement with the construction company, making this an active work site. As you can see, they've been legally delivering materials here. The officer flipped through the papers, nodding as he read. Karen's face twisted as she realized what was happening. "This is entrapment," she blurted. The officer sighed. "No, ma'am, this is a private property matter. And you're trespassing on an active site." He turned to me. "Would you like to press charges?" The look on Karen's face at that moment was something I would cherish for the rest of my life. Pure, unfiltered horror. I pretended to think about it, tapping my chin. "Well," I said, "I do have all the security footage showing them riding in despite the warning signs. And given the damage to my property." Karen turned on her friends, desperate. "You guys will back me up, right?" One of them shook his head. "No way, Karen. You told us this was fine." That was all it took. Karen had officially lost every ounce of control she had. The officers ended up fining her for trespassing and causing property damage. Her ATV had to be towed out at her own expense. Her friends abandoned her. And the best part? This was just the beginning of her downfall. As she stood there, covered in mud, humiliated and realizing she had no power left, I smiled. She had finally learned that my land wasn't hers to take. Karen stood there in the middle of my property, covered in mud, humiliated and completely out of options. The police officer she had so confidently called was now explaining, in very clear terms, that she was the one in trouble. Her ATV sat like a stranded whale in the thick sludge, while her so-called friends were already making their way off my land, pretending they had never been involved in her nonsense in the first place. It was beautiful. For the first time, Karen had no one to back her up. No HOA board to twist the rules in her favor. No mindless supporters to agree with her delusions. Just her, me, and the undeniable fact that she had lost. But she wasn't going to go down without one last, desperate attempt to wriggle her way out of accountability. "This isn't fair," she yelled, her voice shrill with panic. "He set this up. He knew we would come through here. He made this a trap." The officer gave her an unimpressed look. "Ma'am, you entered private property without permission and you ignored multiple warnings. If he wanted to, he could have pressed much more serious charges against you." Karen turned to me, her hands shaking not from fear but from rage. "You did this on purpose," she hissed, her eyes burning with pure hatred. I smiled. "I sure did. And you walked right into it." She let out an inhuman sound, something between a growl and a scream, her mud-soaked hands clenched into fists. I could see her mind racing, trying to find an escape route, some way to turn this situation around. But there wasn't one. I had covered every angle. The officers wrote up the trespassing fine and handed it to her. Karen snatched the paper out of their hands, glared at it like it personally offended her, and then turned her glare back to me. "This isn't over," she spat. I shrugged. "Oh, I think it is." With no other options, she stomped off in the most dramatic way possible, her boots making a disgusting squelching sound with every step through the thick mud. She tried to maintain some dignity, but it was impossible when she looked like a swamp monster. Her ATV had to be hauled out by a tow truck, an expensive process that only added to her misery. By the time she was finally off my property, she had never looked angrier. But the real consequences were only just beginning. Word spread fast. By the next morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing about what had happened. Karen, the untouchable queen of the HOA, had finally been put in her place. People who had once been afraid to stand up to her were now emboldened. It turned out that I wasn't the only one she had bullied over the years. She had made enemies everywhere. People had just been too scared of her power to do anything about it. Till now. The HOA board, which had always been under her control, suddenly wasn't so loyal anymore. They saw what had happened, saw the legal trouble she was facing, and started to distance themselves from her as fast as possible. When she tried to spin the situation at the next HOA meeting, claiming I had set her up, and that she was the victim, it backfired spectacularly. People started speaking up. A retired veteran in the back of the room stood up and called her out on years of harassment. A young couple shared how she had fined them over the color of their front door while breaking rules herself. An older woman revealed how Karen had made her redo her entire fence at her own expense while ignoring complaints about her own property. It was like watching a dam break. For the first time, Karen wasn't in control. She wasn't the one making the rules. She wasn't the one intimidating others into submission. She was on the receiving end of exactly what she had been dishing out for years, and she had no way to stop it. A week later, the HOA voted to remove her as president. It was the final nail in the coffin. She had ruled over the neighborhood for years, treating it like her personal kingdom, and now it had been taken from her in the most public way possible. She tried to fight it, of course, threatening lawsuits, demanding recounts, insisting it was all some sort of conspiracy against her. But there was nothing she could do. She had burned too many bridges, made too many enemies, and now she was facing the consequences of her actions. She lasted another month in the neighborhood before she finally cracked. She couldn't stand being powerless, couldn't stand the fact that people were openly laughing about what had happened to her. She put her house up for sale and left in a hurry, vanishing like a bad memory. The day she moved out was one of the most peaceful I had ever experienced. I sat on my porch drinking my coffee, watching as the moving truck pulled away. My land was mine again. No more tire tracks, no more ATVs, no more Karen. Just quiet, just peace. And the best part? The neighborhood changed for the better. Without her constant interference, people were actually happier. The HOA meetings became civil discussions instead of shouting matches. Neighbors actually talked to each other instead of living in fear of what rule would be enforced next. The community healed. As for me, I went back to enjoying my property the way I had always intended. The land, once scarred by Karen's recklessness, slowly recovered. Grass grew back, fences were repaired, and my dog no longer cowered at the sound of engines. One afternoon, I took a slow walk across my property, just taking it all in. The air was fresh, the sky was clear, and for the first time in what felt like forever, my land was exactly the way it was supposed to be. Mine. As I stood there, I couldn't help but laugh. Karen had thought she could take whatever she wanted, bend the rules to her will, and treat everyone like they existed for her amusement. She had been so sure of herself, so untouchable. But in the end, all it took was a little patience, a little planning, and the perfect trap to bring her crashing down. The only tracks on my land now? Just peace, quiet, and my dog's happy little paws.